When we think of challenges, we often imagine personal or professional obstacles or even unexpected crises that arise in our lives. But what about when these challenges come from God? The book of Deuteronomy tells a story of challenge, but also of opportunity. An opportunity to renew the covenant with God and ensure a prosperous future for a generation that, although marked by divine mercy, also needs to learn from the mistakes of the past. Deuteronomy, Moses' last challenge, Israel's last call to obedience, is not just a historical account. It is an invitation, a direct call to the people of Israel and to us today to reflect on obedience to God and the transformative power of following His will. If you've ever found yourself facing difficult decisions, fearing the consequences of a mistake, or questioning the right direction to take, what Moses said may be the reminder you need. If you want to understand how this message can impact your life and how to apply the principles of Deuteronomy in your daily life, sign up now and follow our content so you don't miss the next chapters of this journey of faith. Don't put off the time, act as now. In his final words, Moses not only recounts Israel's history, but also offers a final exhortation to faithfulness. He knows that the people's future depends on obedience to God's commandments. And the big question is, are you ready to hear and respond to this call? Because the answer, no matter how challenging, is the key to victory in your own promised land. If you want to understand how this message can impact your life and how to apply these principles to your daily journey, keep reading. What Moses has to say is not just for an ancient people, but for all of us in every age. Don't miss the chance to reflect and act on this divine invitation. Israel's journey through the desert was long and difficult. After 40 years of wandering, the generation that had witnessed the exodus and liberation from Egypt is about to disappear. Now, a new generation prepares to enter Canaan, the promised land. But before that, Moses, now 120 years old, feels it is his duty to remind the people of the laws and commandments given by God. Entering Canaan would not be just a geographical change, but a new spiritual beginning, where obedience will be the key to prosperity and the promise of long life in the land. Moses, with his wisdom gained over the years, knew that the new generation needed to be taught. Despite God's promises, the promised land would not be conquered by pure luck or human strength. The people needed to follow God's instructions to the letter with obedience and faithfulness. Deuteronomy, the book that records Moses' final words, is more than a simple repetition of laws. It is a call to reflection, fidelity, and responsibility regarding the covenant with God. The importance of remembering the law before crossing the Jordan is clear. The people were about to face a new kind of life in a land of riches and challenges. But how could they remain steadfast in the face of temptation, prosperity, and adversity? Moses knew the key was to remain faithful to covenant, remember commandments, avoid idolatry, and above all, practice obedience with a willing heart. It was Moses' final challenge, but also the last and most important gift. He could leave Israel a reminder of the path to life. What happened to the previous generation is a lesson that cannot be ignored. When Moses sent spies into Canaan, they returned with a report of fear and distrust. 10 spies declared that the land was good, but full of giants that would be impossible to defeat. Only Joshua and Caleb kept the faith, believing that, with God's help, they could conquer the promised land. However, the majority of the people allowed themselves to be overcome by fear and disobedience, refusing to follow divine guidance. The consequences of this failure of faith were harsh and unforgiving. God declared that the generation that doubted and murmured would not enter Canaan. Instead, they would be condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, until all unbelievers died. Only Joshua and Caleb, the 2 faithful spies, would survive, and they would be responsible for leading the next generation to the promised land. This episode serves as a clear warning. Disobeying God out of fear or lack of faith brings inevitable consequences, and God's mercy does not erase the realities of disobedience. Even after 40 years of wandering and trials, the people still had to deal with the sin of disobedience that had marked their history. Moses did not hesitate to recall the episode of Baal Peor, where idolatry and immorality led to the destruction of many. This moment in Israel's history became a point of reflection. What was truly at stake was obedience to God's laws and commandments, the only way to keep the covenant intact and ensure that future generations would not fall into the same errors. Israel's wanderings through the wilderness were not a purposeless journey. During those 40 years, Israel was not left a chance. God, with patience and faithfulness, guided the people step by step, protecting and guiding them. The journey through the wilderness involved more than just a search for the promised land. It was a process of purification and learning. For example, as Israel passed through lands like Edom and Ammon, God clearly instructed them not to attack these nations, as those lands did not belong to them. This demonstrated God's faithfulness to his word, reminding the people that the conquest of Canaan would come in due time, according to his plan. And this journey wasn't just about restrictions. During the pilgrimage, the people experienced remarkable victories. The defeat of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, was a clear demonstration of God's power in action. Israel didn't have a large military force, but when they obeyed God's instructions, they saw God's power manifest in decisive battles. The victory over these kings not only strengthened the people's faith, but also served as preparation for the greater battles to come in Canaan. God's faithfulness was evident in each victory, but also in the lessons learned from each defeat. Moses spoke not only of how the people should act, but also how they should understand God's power on their journey. The desert was more than a place of scarcity and hardship. It was also a place of revelation and intimacy with God. During these years, the people were shaped, tested, and prepared. Obedience, even in the face of hardship, became the only way to ensure final conquest. It was in the desert that the people saw themselves as dependent on God, and it was through obedience to his commands that Israel demonstrated their faith and commitment to the established covenant. When Israel finally advanced to take possession of the conquered lands, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh received their territories east of the Jordan. These lands, while not Canaan, represented an important part of God's promise. The distribution of these lands was not merely a matter of geography, but a reflection of how God fulfilled his promises, even during their wanderings. These tribes were grateful for the victory, but also aware that the work was not yet complete. They had been successful in helping to conquer the lands, but now the great challenge was to ensure faithfulness to God in the new territory. Moses, already aware that his mission was coming to an end, knew that Joshua would be responsible for continuing his leadership. It was his task to lead the people across the Jordan and to the definitive conquest of Canaan. But before passing the baton to Joshua, Moses gave him clear instructions, directing him not to stray, but to proceed with courage, faith, and, above all, obedience to God. The example of Joshua, who had not wavered during the 40 years of wandering, was essential in strengthening the people. Moses fully trusted Joshua's leadership, and this trust should be a reminder to the people that obedience to God, through his leadership, was the only path to victory. The distribution of land also had great symbolic significance. Each tribe that received its portion of land was, in practice, committing to live according to God's commandments. It wasn't simply a matter of occupying a piece of territory, but of living in accordance with the covenant established with the Lord. The promised land was not a gift to be taken at will, but something to be conquered with obedience and honor. Commitment to God's covenant was, ultimately, what would ensure well-being and prosperity in the conquered lands. The moment had arrived. Moses, knowing his strength was running out, called the people to hear God's words with a new heart and a renewed mind. He knew that the only way to live well in Canaan and ensure prosperity in the promised land was to obey God's commandments. Obedience was not optional, but a requirement for maintaining the covenant with God. Moses, in his final words, emphasized that obedience would bring blessings, while disobedience would result in disgrace. The promised land was not merely a prize for conquest, but a place where faithfulness to God should be the foundation of the people's entire lives. Moses used the example of Baal Peor, where many in Israel had strayed, giving in to idolatry and sin. He warned sternly against any form of idolatry, reminding them that sin had devastating consequences. By disobeying, the people distanced themselves from God's mercy, opening the door to destruction. The destruction of the idolaters at Baal Peor was a reminder that all faithfulness to God cannot be negotiated. It is easy to be seduced by the temptations of idol worship, but this means abandoning the true source of life and prosperity. Obedience, then, becomes the only safe path. Moses' call to obedience was not merely a moral exhortation, but a practical instruction. He did not want the people to lose themselves in abstract concept of faith, but to live it out in their daily lives. Living according to God's commandments, practicing true worship, and avoiding any form of idolatry was the most effective way to ensure the continuation of the covenant and divine protection. Rather than relying on external forces, Israel should depend on faithful obedience to God's will, which had guided them thus far, and which would now lead them to definitive conquest of Canaan. Moses knew that for the people to remain steadfast in obedience, they needed to remember God's powerful manifestations in their lives. Mount Sinai was a landmark of the supernatural encounter, where the people heard God's voice and experienced an unparalleled demonstration of divine power. But there was something peculiar about this encounter. The people saw no image, no physical representation of God. This, in fact, was a great favor. By not showing them an image, God protected them from the error of idolatry, something that had always posed a threat to Israel. The encounter at Sinai was not meant to be a mere memory, but a constant reminder that God is spirit and cannot be reduced to images or idols. However, Moses knew that the temptation to create idols was always lurking. He knew that, upon entering the land of Canaan, the people would encounter many pagan influences and idolatrous practices. Therefore, he strongly warned against any form of idolatry, reminding them that if they strayed from God and fell into this error, the consequences would be serious. They would be scattered among the nations and lose their identity. Worshipping the Lord without intermediaries or images was the only way to maintain the covenant intact and the relationship with the true God. The idols that the nations around Israel worshiped were false, created by human hands, and therefore powerless. The grandeur of the encounter at Sinai and the lack of a visible image of God served as a vital reminder to the people. There was no substitute for pure and true worship of the Lord. Moses knew that the greatest mistake the people could make was to create something that would distract them from their true source of life, God. He wanted the people to always remember the voice they heard and the covenant that was made on that mountain. True faith is not based on the visible, but on the invisible, on what cannot be touched or represented. This was a path to true worship and obedience, something Israel needed to keep in their hearts and minds, generating fidelity throughout the generations. Moses cannot fail to emphasize something essential to Israel: the uniqueness of God. The Lord was not like the other gods worshipped by the nations around Israel. They had their idols, made of wood or stone, which could not hear, speak, or act. But God, the Lord of Israel, was alive and powerful. Moses reminded the people that no other people had ever experienced what Israel had. No other nation had heard God's voice the way the people of Israel had on Mount Sinai. They had witnessed something extraordinary: the deliverance from Egypt through powerful miracles and God's constant protection and provision throughout their wanderings in the desert. The wonder of the Exodus, as Moses described it, was indisputable evidence of God's unique power. When God delivered Israel from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, he demonstrated not only his power, but also his faithfulness to the covenant he made with the patriarchs. The people of Israel should never forget how much God loved them and chose them to be his people. In all their trials in the wilderness, he did not leave them nor forsake them. Every victory and every moment of provision testified to God's immense care. The story of Israel was no ordinary story. It was a story of a unique, powerful, and personal God. This recognition of God's uniqueness was to be the foundation of Israel's life. They could not allow outside influences to divert them from the truth. Faithfulness to God was what had made them a distinct people, and more importantly, a nation that could be part of God's plan of redemption. Moses, in recalling this great deed, called the people not only to remember, but to live up to this calling. The God who had delivered Israel from Egypt, who had guided and fed them in the wilderness, was the same God who would lead them to victory in Canaan. Trust in his uniqueness was to be the reason they continued to follow his commandments and maintain their pure worship. The 10 Commandments are undoubtedly the backbone of the covenant between God and Israel. Moses knew that these laws were not merely rules for social life, but principles that reflected the very essence of God's will for his people. They were a clear guide for community life, establishing what was just right and holy. Moses reaffirmed each of the commandments to ensure that the new generation understood and followed them seriously. It wasn't just about obeying external rules, but about cultivating an internal life aligned with God's will, which was the only way to ensure the covenant would remain firm. In recapitulating the Ten Commandments, Moses highlighted some fundamental principles that would govern Israel's life. There was to be no room for idolatry, theft, murder, adultery, or lying. These sins were grave because they violated the very nature of Israel's relationship with God and with one another. Each commandment represented an opportunity to live justly, with integrity, and with faithfulness. For example, the prohibition of idolatry was not only about avoiding the worship of false gods, but also about protecting the human heart from straying from the true source of life. Worship of God was to be exclusive, without any attempt at manipulation or substitution. Moses also emphasized the importance of honoring one's parents, not coveting what belongs to one's neighbor, and keeping the Sabbath holy. These commandments were not merely a series of prohibitions, but invitations to a full life that reflected divine order. Living according to the Ten Commandments was, in practice, living according to God's will, which brought peace, harmony, and prosperity. By teaching these commandments, Moses was, in effect, providing the key to a life of blessing. Obedience to these laws was an act of love for God and neighbor, and only then could Israel live with dignity and blessing in the Promised Land. When the people of Israel stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, God's presence was so powerful and terrifying that the people themselves were filled with fear. God's voice was so imposing, so direct, that they could no longer bear direct contact with him. The fear was evident, and the people asked Moses to intercede for them. They knew that God's holiness was beyond human reach. This fear, however, was not a paralyzing fear, but a reverent fear, the kind of fear that brings awareness of God's greatness and the need to obey his commandments. God, hearing the people's fear, did not rebuke them, but rather validated them. He said their fear was good, for it was a sign that they recognized his authority and power. However, he encouraged them not to fear, but to continue with a heart turned to him, keeping his commandments and living according to his will. Healthy fear was not the end, but the beginning of a sincere relationship with God. He wanted the people to fear him, but at the same time, to trust him enough to obey and follow his direction. This balance between reverent fear and complete trust is essential in anyone's journey of faith. Moses then reinforced the idea that the fear of God should be continuous and preserved throughout all generations. Fear should not be a passing feeling, but a lifestyle, an attitude toward God's holiness and majesty. When the people feared God, they were more likely to obey and thus avoid the mistakes of the past. God's care for Israel was clear. He wanted them to live in holiness and prosperity, but this required them to remain with their hearts turned to him, always remembering the awe they felt at Sinai. Fear should not distance them from God, but rather draw them closer to his presence, so that obedience would flow naturally as a response to love and reverence for his name. Moses knew his journey was coming to an end, and with that, he left final instructions that would be crucial to Israel's future. He urged the people never to forget their covenant with God, for it was the foundation of all the blessings they were about to receive. Obedience to God's commandments was not optional, but the key to living well in the Promised Land. Moses wanted the people to understand that the continuation of this covenant depended on the faithfulness of each generation. God's promise was not limited to one generation, but should be passed down from generation to generation, so that obedience would remain alive and vibrant throughout time. It was with this goal in mind that Moses also urged the people to teach God's commandments to their children and grandchildren. He knew that commitment to the covenant must be cultivated within the family, within the home. It was not enough for parents to follow God's commands. It was essential that they pass this commitment on to future generations. Israel's future depended on the new generation's faithfulness to the covenant established with God. The people could not allow true worship to be forgotten or devalued over time. Teaching children to fear and obey God was the only way to ensure that the Promised Land would be a place of lasting blessings. Moses was, in a sense, making a final appeal to the people's collective memory. He knew that with his departure, many things might be forgotten. The human tendency to turn away from God was a reality Moses had seen over the years. However, he trusted that if the people kept the covenant alive in their hearts and passed it on to their descendants, God would continue to be faithful, guaranteeing them prosperity and long life in the land. Loyalty to God was not to be temporary, but characteristic that spanned generations, perpetuating the legacy of faith and obedience that had begun with the patriarchs. Moses concluded his words with a powerful exhortation. Obedience to God would guarantee not only long life, but also prosperity in the land being given to Israel. The promise of abundant life was conditional. The people of Israel had two options before them: follow God's commandments, living according to his will, or stray and face the consequences of disobedience. Obedience was not a burden, but the path to the full realization of God's promise. The land of Canaan, which was to be a place of blessing, would only become a prosperous home if Israel remained faithful to the covenant. The path of obedience was not an easy one either. It required the people to remain vigilant, not straying to the right or the left, as Moses instructed. It was a path of constant care, discipline, and, above all, faith. Israel's journey would not be without difficulties or battles, but Moses assured them that if the people remained loyal to God, he would guide them every step of the way, defeating enemies and overcoming obstacles. Obedience to God was not a one-off task. It was an ongoing journey, where each choice aligned with God's will. Finally, Moses reminded the people that the promise of long life was not just a physical reward, but a spiritual one. Living according to God's commandments was the true key to fulfillment. Obedience would result not only in prosperity on earth, but also in a life of peace with God and others. Moses concluded his message with a powerful invitation for each person, from generation to generation, to faithfully follow God. The journey of faith would always be challenging, but ultimately, it would lead to fulfillment of God's promise, both on earth and in eternity. The decision was in Israel's hands to follow or to stray.